Well, thank you very much. I'm not accustomed to addressing a group from the altar, but I must confess it does give me a certain sense of authority. So if there's a bolt of lightning that comes out at any time, you'll know that that's all been prescripted. It's great to be here, and it's great to be back in Guelph, and particularly good for me to be able to pay tribute to my colleague Frank Valerian, who's stepping down as a member of Parliament, and who's for some reason taken the trouble to come and hear me tonight. He's heard down many of my speeches. You've had wonderful representation in Parliament, and I look forward to your choice on October the 19th. I hope that it is a wise one and expressed in a spirit of liberal generosity. I wrote this book because I wanted to try to describe for people a little bit about how I've seen the world of politics change. And not always for the better, but nevertheless a process that we have to understand a little more, and in the hope that we can change things, and in the hope that through the process of dialogue and citizen participation, we can encourage a process of change in the way in which our politics operates. When I entered politics in the medieval period, in 1978, I was first elected to Parliament. I was in a small caucus of about 16 people, and Mr. Pierre Trudeau was the Prime Minister of Canada, and we were approaching towards the end of his term of office. And I, of course, was very excited as a 30-year-old MP, first elected in a by-election. And I found a Parliament that was really quite interesting. Mr. Douglas was still there. Mr. Stanfield was still there. And Mr. Diefenbaker was still there. And I can assure you that they were all active participants in Parliament, even though they all were planning to step down before, through the next election, which came about 8 months later. And I gave a speech, and a few people stayed behind, and Raina Titian, who went on to become the Governor General, heckled me gently. Lincoln Alexander, who went on to become the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, gently heckled me. And Mr. Chrétien, who was the Minister of Finance at the time, heckled me, but not so gently. And it was a wonderful introduction to parliamentary life as it then was. At the end of the day, members of the different parties would go out for dinner together, and long friendships had been developed and points of view. And in the House itself, question period was relatively spontaneous. Questions were asked, but they weren't necessarily scripted. Nobody was quite sure what words were going to come out of anybody's mouth. And the ministers, cabinet ministers, would respond. So that parliamentary experience was my introduction to Parliament. And when in the next 2 parliaments later, after Joe Clark's interim experience, and I have a lot of affection for Joe, and a lot of people said to me that, what did I think Mr. Clark's biggest mistake was? Well, I said, what Mr. Clark's biggest mistake was the comment that he made when he was asked in his first press conference, how did he intend to deal with the fact that he was 5 seats short of a majority? And he said he was not going to be put off by that. He was going to govern as if he had a majority. which is sort of like jumping out of a plane as if you have a parachute. It really helps if you have one. And if you don't, then things go awry, which is what happened. Mr. Trudeau came back, and we debated the great question of the day, which for us at that time was over a 2-year period. We debated the patriation of the Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I can tell you, as a young MP, it was a totally fascinating time. A time in which we were talking about the fundamentals of our country, whether we were ready to adopt our own Constitution, whether we were prepared for the change to a written Constitution, whether we were prepared to have a Charter of Rights which would give additional responsibilities to the courts to assess the appropriateness from a constitutional standpoint and from the standpoint of the protection of the interests of the individual, the liberties of the individual, and to make that assessment. And we had a very emotional, complicated, tough debate. The government listened to some things, changed legislation, changed the charter. There was a whole bunch of things going on, all of which involved give and take, sometimes angry frustration, references to the court, the premiers were involved. It was quite an exciting period. So I left at that point after the charter was introduced and adopted by Parliament. My last vote as a MP in 1982 was in favor of the patriation, with the notwithstanding clause and with all the other changes that had been made. And it was a very proud moment, and I wanted to stay until that was done. And then, as you know, I became the leader of the Provincial New Democrats, and through a long story, then returned to Parliament in 2008. What did I find when I came back? Well, it was a scripted universe. And perhaps you can tell from my presentation tonight, I don't exactly fit into the scripted universe. And it was a scripted universe in which questions were vetted and rewritten, and answers were, not that I was ever giving one because I was always in opposition, were obviously completely written. And in fact, you began to notice that no matter what your question was, the answer was always the same. It was a script. And when you think about it, the only other place in which this would take place is an insane asylum. Because it's the only place in which people would just perhaps talk whatever for whatever reason. And Parliament began to me to resemble this kind of disconnect. Because we were being given answers and words that had been tested in focus groups. And we were being given repeated answers that were part of what is now called the permanent campaign. There was no distinction between governing and campaigning. In my experience, not to invite any of you to go back to those days in Ontario, but in my experience, there was a difference between campaigning and governing. Once you won the election, you were no longer, in my opinion, my view, perhaps wrong-headed, you were no longer an entirely partisan figure. You often had to take decisions that were not pleasant and might offend some of your supporters. But you did them because you felt that was the right thing to do. And because that was what the public interest required. This isn't what happens now in our life. This isn't the thinking, this isn't the mindset that drives a government. What drives a government today is the notion that the campaign goes for 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It never stops. To the point where question period is not a parliamentary exercise, but a campaign exercise, in which the questions to some degree, but certainly the answers to the nth degree, unless things go wrong, which delightfully sometimes they do. Somebody actually says what he thinks or she thinks, or screws up, which makes life interesting. But it is incredible the extent to which we're now into a scripted exercise. Now, that exercise is a substitute, in my opinion, for what Parliament should be and how politics should operate. So in my book, I talk about leadership, how I've seen leaders act, and how I've seen leaders not act, how leadership is still essential for the political process, how, in fact, there are things in our society which have changed, which have lowered the level of trust and lowered the sense that people have that if some people are doing well, they're going to do well at the same time. But that isn't exactly what people see in their economy today. So the disconnect that we see in politics is matched by the disconnect that we see in the economy. And of course, the big phenomenon, which we're all wrestling with, is the fact that the participation rates in elections among people who are under the age of 35 has consistently been declining, not only in Canada, but in the United States, as well as all over Europe. This is a big secular trend. And it's very troublesome. Because what it essentially means is that although we have a universal franchise, that franchise is not universally expressed. To put it bluntly, who won the last election? Actually, if you want to know who won the last election, it is none of the above. Because the people who didn't vote got more votes, if you like, by being absent than any of the people that were running. Which, when you think about it, is kind of crazy. If this was true of a business, people would say there's something wrong with this model. There's something not working in the way this is supposed to work. And you can tell me better than I can tell you. Why is it that people don't vote? People don't vote and people are obviously political scientists and others are constantly trying to assess this, but people don't vote because they don't think it makes any difference. They don't vote because people aren't talking about the issues that matter to them. They don't vote because they're not that unhappy with the way things are going, and therefore they don't vote, or they don't vote because they're so unhappy with the way things are going that they have no interest in doing anything to perpetuate the process. Will Rogers, the great American Aboriginal humorist, not well known that Will Rogers was a proud member of First Nation in the United States, but he used to say that he didn't believe in voting because it only encouraged them. That's an interesting perspective. The book also talks about another challenge that I see, which is the difficulty we have in talking about issues and how it's very difficult to go beyond the slogans to talk about substance, and how frustrating this is for people and how frustrating it is for many of us who have an interest in what actually government does.